The high wall of the canyon threw a shadow over the entrance to the shallow cave where the two men stood staring at the skeleton that lay on the sandy floor. Only a few rags remained of the man's clothing, and the dried out twisted leather of gun belts and boots. The front part of the head had been blown away by a bullet fired from behind. Another bullet could still be seen lodged down low into the man's spine. The taller and older of the two men lifted his eyes to his companion. "Are you sure it's him? There ain't much to go on, Jim." Lachlan's face was lonely. This was the last member of a once closely knit family who lay there. His brother had loved and admired, who pleaded with him to come west before the war. "I don't need anything anymore, nearly. See where the left elbow was broken? I helped set it in a buffalo wallow while we fought off a bunch of Comanches." That gun belt was his own work. He did it himself. He was a good man, Pike. Too good a man to be trailed here and murdered after he was wounded. "My guess would be that bullet in the spine crippled him," nearly Pike suggested. "Why, I suppose he came here. Was he just hunting a place to hide, or did he figure you'd be along?" "He sent for me, like I told you. This is where we were to meet. So he must have had some reason why he did not want me riding the place down without seeing him first. He camped here on Savory Creek before he built down in the valley, so he told me all about the place." "You won't have anything to go on," Pike observed. "There's no sign left after all these years. There's two things. His guns are gone, and so somebody packed them off, and there's the ranch." Somebody will have it, and that will have that somebody will have questions to answer. He turned away. "We'll be back and very improper when this is settled. A few more days or weeks won't matter now. From now on, we're hunting 2 ivory-butted guns, and each will have 3 grooves filed in the bottom of the butt." The trail to Toyabe was dusty and long. Clouds hung heavy with the promise of rain. But as the hours passed, it failed to develop. Wise with the wisdom of 40 years west of the Missouri, nearly Pike knew the manner of man with whom he rode. Yet he was a man who wanted nothing more than peace, and saw little in the weeks ahead. 10 years before, George Lachlan, accompanied by his much younger brother Jim, was riding through this country heading home to Texas when they saw the V where Antelope Valley points back toward the notch of the mountains. There was water and grass. With lakes and timber nearby hills. It was then George told his brother he had found what he wanted, and he would come back here and settle in this ground and make a home for them here. As they spoke of their plans, they were sheltered in the same shallow cave on Savory Creek where his bones now lay. Jim Lachlan had stayed on in Texas, but then he came the note. "Come on out, Jim. I bought you a place called Horse Heaven up in the mountains. I bought it in your name and filed the deed in the courthouse at Jacobsville. Looks like a bit of trouble here, so I could use a good hand. If you don't find me, look up a man named Reed Castle." At the time the note came, Jim Lachlan had been trailing north with the herd, and as they were short-handed, there was no way he'd leave. The mention of trouble had not alarmed him, as it had not been emphasized, and he knew George could handle trouble. They would need money to develop their property, so he took on a job ramrodding a herd from Dodge City to Canada, and there he drifted south toward Texas, pausing long enough in Deadwood to strike it rich in a small way. Finally, back in Texas, he paid off old debts and banked the rest. Only then did he start west. "They might have buried him," Pike commented. "A man deserves that." I'm glad they didn't. Now I know he was murdered. He was a good man, Pike, but he asked nothing from anyone and gave all he could. He could be a hard man, but this is a hard country. We best say nothing about who we are, Pike commented as they sighted the first buildings of Toyabe. If we listen, we might learn something. Good idea. You rouse some grub, and I'll rouse us around and see what I can hear. It's been a good while, but if we can get some old-timers talking, the rest should be easy. Toyabe was booming. In the bottom of its steep wall canyons, the town's few streets were jammed with freighters' outfits. The recently arrived stage, buckboards from ranches, and horses lining the hitching trail. Aside from being the supply center for the ranches, it was also the headquarters for miners and for the men who worked in the sawmill. The Fish Creek Saloon was run by Fish Creek Burns, whose faded blue eyes had looked sadly upon a world that stretched from his boyhood in the Cumberland Gap country through the Council Bluffs to the Platte and west to the Rockies and back again by way of Abilene, Dodge, El Paso, Tascosa, and Santa Fe. He was a man of many interests, few loyalties, and no illusions. Now suddenly his hand stopped, utterly still, on the glass he'd been polishing. A man really surprised, he was now startled at immobility. Slowly then, after a moment, the hands began to move once more. Under the straw-colored brows, the eyes lost their momentary sharpness and assumed the faded normal lack of luster. Yet the mind behind them was busy. The man who had come through the door was 2 inches under 6 feet, but broad in the chest and thick in the shoulders. He was a man in his 20s, but compact and sharp, the lean brown face holding the harsh lines of one much older. Fish Creek Burns never forgot a face or loyalty. "Rye," Lachlan said mildly. "It's been a dusty ride." "This time of year," Burns agreed, putting bottle and glass before him. Down the bar was Chance Verrill, and behind the stranger was a poker table where one of the players was Reed Castle of the OZ spread. Burns' eyes shifted to Lachlan. "Drifting? Staying. Hunting a job?" "No, but maybe I'll have an outfit for my own." Burns' tone was dry and casual as he picked up another glass. "That big man with the black mustache at the table behind you runs a lot of cattle in Antelope Valley a way back." His eyes met Lachlan's. "Where the valley notches the mountains." Jim Lachlan was immediately alert. What was this bartender trying to tell him? That ranch in the Notch Hills belonged to his brother. Burns' face was without expression. He was polishing another glass. Has he had the place long? 3 years or so. He's doing right well. The last letter from George had been mailed just about 3 years ago. Jim wanted to turn and look, but did not. Maybe he could use a hand. Does he have a name? Reed Castle, Burns cited through the glass. He's a big man around here. A man who makes money fast, makes both friends and enemies. Down the bar, the tall man in the white hat and blue coat is Chance Verrill, and some say he could have a dozen notches on his gun if he wanted. Verrill was taller than Lachlan with sharply cut features, cold as a prowling fox. As Lachlan looked, Verrill's eyes turned and stopped suddenly on Lachlan. The big man in the black broadcloth suit, Burns continued, is Creighton Burt, district attorney. A man with nerve, a man of integrity. He doesn't like Reed Castle. Disturbed by the interest in Verrill's eyes, Jim leaned on his forearms on the bar and asked Burns, "Do I look like somebody you know?" Verrill acts like he's seen me before somewhere. Fish Creek kept his eyes on the glass in his hands. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a man around here named George Lachlan, and you're somewhat like him. Some said that Lachlan and Verrill weren't friendly. Verrill hasn't been here long either, right around 3 years, I'd say. Thanks. I would take it you were friendly to George Lachlan? Oh, he was one of the finest men I ever came across. However, I'd not speak his name about town if I were you. Thank you, he finished his drink. By the way, there's a man traveling with me, a tall old man named Nearly Pike. He may be in. Jim Lachlan managed a casual glance around the room that took in both Creighton, Bird, and Reed Castle. The former was large, fat, and untidy. Castle was big and obviously prosperous. He wore a black mustache, and his face was strong-boned, domineering face and a bold one. The face of a man who would ride roughshod over obstacles. Jim turned and went out, letting the door swing to behind him, turned quickly in the crowd and crossed the street. It would be a mistake to become a focus of their attention too soon. Glancing back, he saw Chance Farrow standing in the door, staring after him. Lachlan went to the harness shop, and after a minute, out the side door to the alley and across the general store where Pike was loading supplies into a couple of stacks. Nearly Pike's Adam's apple bobbed in his scrawny throat. Place in Hoss heaven is lived on, he said, keeping his voice low. Some gal moved on the place with an engine. She's been having trouble with a man named Reed Castle. Lachlan was watching the street through the window. What else? Cattle range is sewed up slick and tight between four men. Reed Castle has Antelope Valley north of the mountains. John Shippey has the Monitor and Burly Eyes and Smoky. Neil Chase has the Diamond outfit. They won't let anybody drive through or in. Get the horses around back up and load up. I'm getting some ammunition. Leaving the older man, Lachlan went over to the counter. He loved the old familiar smell of such stores. The smell of spices, freshly ground coffee, no new leathers, dry goods, and the sweetest smell of gun oil. After buying 100 rounds of .44 ammunition, he glanced at a new shotgun, a short-barreled gun of the Expression gun type. Express gun type, carried by shotgun messengers. Give me that scattergun, he said, and 100 rounds for it. The storekeeper, a short, stout man, glanced up. You must figure to fight a war without ammunition and a shotgun? Never cared for one myself. Lachlan smiled pleasantly. Good for quail. I like bird meat. He loaded the shotgun. Only empty guns that hurt folks, he commented, smiling. I like mine loaded. He thrust the muzzle of the shotgun into the grocery sack and gathered the top of the burlap around his trigger guard, carrying it with the stock almost invisible behind his forearm. As for wars, I never fight unless folk push it on me. However, he paused briefly, I plan to go into the cattle business here. The storekeeper's head came up from the bill he was adding. If you figure on that, you better double your order for ammunition. This is a closed country. Uncle Sam doesn't say so. Uncle Sam doesn't run this country. The Big Four run it, and that means Reed Castle. Jim smiled. Ever hear, he asked gently, of a cowman named George Lachlan? The fat man straightened slowly, staring at him. He half turned aside, starting to speak, and then said nothing. Lachlan went to the front door and stepped out, calling back to Pike as he did so. He stepped out right into the middle of the trouble. Confronting him was a huge back, the top of the shoulders on the level with his eyes. The vest split down the back from the strain of huge shoulders and power muscles. The man wore a six-shooter, and his hand gripped the butt. Beyond him, Jim could see a young Indian, straight and tall, his face expressionless. He was unarmed. You're a dirty, thieving rustler, the big man was saying. Get out of the country. We don't need your kind. I steal no cows. Don't you be calling me no liar. The big man's fingers grasped the gun butt tighter, and he started to draw. Lachlan's left hand shot out and grasped the big man's wrist. With a startled grunt, the big man began to turn, and Lachlan let him turn, but at the same time he shoved up and back on the gun wrist he held, pushing the elbow higher until the gun muscle was back out of the holster. The big man struck viciously, but Lachlan was too close, and the blow curled around his neck. At the same time, he was shoving the big man back and keeping him off balance. The big man's back slammed against an awning post, and Jim twisted hard on the wrist. The gun dropped from the man's fingers, and instantly Jim stepped back and drew the shotgun from the sack. "The Indian wasn't harmed," he said, "and I'll see no man murdered." The flash of sunlight on the big blue-black barrel of the shotgun had cleared the street behind the big man as if by magic. Slowly, the big man began to rub his wrist. No call to butt in, stranger. Nobody pushes Ives around. "We've no quarrel," Lachlan said, "unless you come looking for it, or unless you're one of those who murdered my brother and stole his ranch." There was silence in the street. Somebody shifted his weight, and the boardwalk creaked. "Who? What did you say your name was?" "My name is Lachlan, Ives. Jim Lachlan, brother to George Lachlan, who was dry gulched and murdered up in the monitors about 3 years ago." Ives stepped back another step, still rubbing his wrist. He glanced around hastily as if looking for a way out or for help. Chance Farrow stood across the street. Near him was Reed Castle. "Those are hard words, friend," Farrow said. "Before you make such a statement, you better have proof." "I have proof of the murder. As yet, I do not have the murderers." "You are mistaken," Reed Castle said carelessly, but speaking for the onlookers more than for him. "George Lachlan sold his ranch to me and left the country. Whatever you think you know is a mistake. George left here under his own power." Jim's shotgun held steady. "Castle," he replied, his voice ringing the length of the street, "you're a liar. I have a better letter from my brother telling me of the trouble he was having and asking me to come out. He had no intention of selling out, and he did have plans for developing the ranch. As for your ownership, I'm asking you right now before the town of Toyabe for you to produce a bill of sale. I want to see it in the office of Creighton Burt not later than the day after tomorrow." There was no movement. The street held its silence. Nobody realized better than Reed Castle the position he faced. Since acquiring the Antelope Valley property, nothing had stopped him. His personality and strength had drawn Shippey, Chase, and Ives to him into the combine he formed. Other cattlemen had been frozen out or driven out, and Castle was building strong and deep. In the town itself, only Creighton Burt held out against him in the open, although Castle was well aware that many lesser men both feared and hated him. Now he had been called a liar in the open street. He had been indirectly accused of murder and theft. Nor would the story stop with the borders of this small town. It would be told and repeated in Carson, Austin, and Eureka. "We'll make it noon, Castle. Show up with your bill of sale, and if you have the signature better be valid." Coolly, he lowered his shotgun, picked up the drop sack, and walked across the street. Nearly Pike waited at the corner of the alley, his rifle in his hands. "Wall, son, you sure laid down your argument. Now, they've got to put up or shut up." The ride to Horse Heaven was by a devious route. Neither man knew exactly where they were going, just a general direction and some landmarks to look for. They headed northeast when leaving Toyabe, and they turned back to the southwest through Ackerman Canyon. Daylight found them camped near Antelope Peak. From there, they turned back into the hills, climbing steadily through the pines and aspen, riding warily, for they understood their situation was without discussion. The easy way out, perhaps the only way, was to have Lachlan killed so he could not appear at Burt's office. If he did not appear, could it be shrugged off as the talk of some loud-mouthed drifter? There will be criticism, but Castle could merely say that he had been there, ready with his bill of sale. And where was this so-called Lachlan fellow?